Most people believe change begins with motivation, a surge of determination, a powerful realization, a moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. They believe that moment will transform them, that a strong decision will permanently reshape their behavior. But motivation is unstable. It rises and disappears without warning. It feels powerful in the moment and weak the next day. This is why so many people experience the same cycle: a burst of motivation, a few days of intense effort, then a gradual return to old behavior. They assume the problem is discipline. They assume they simply need stronger willpower. But willpower is not the real problem. The real problem is structure. Because behavior does not exist in isolation, it emerges from systems, from patterns repeated every day, from habits that quietly shape how decisions are made. If your daily structure supports distraction, distraction becomes easy. If your environment encourages delay, delay becomes automatic. The mind adapts to whatever system surrounds it. It follows the path that requires the least resistance, the routine that has been practiced most often. This is why motivation alone cannot produce lasting change. Motivation can start movement, but it cannot sustain movement, because motivation requires constant emotion, and emotion is temporary. Habits operate differently. They do not require excitement. They do not require inspiration. They require repetition. The first time a behavior is difficult, the second time it is slightly easier. After enough repetition, the mind begins to automate it. This automation is powerful because it removes the need for motivation. The action simply happens. Wake up, start the work, train, repeat. At first, these actions require effort, but over time, the resistance fades. The routine becomes familiar, predictable. Eventually, the behavior stops feeling optional. It becomes the normal structure of your day. This is the quiet power of habit. It replaces motivation with structure, emotion with repetition, excitement with consistency. And consistency always outlasts intensity. Because intensity burns quickly, consistency compounds slowly. Day after day, action after action, habit after habit, until progress stops depending on how you feel and begins depending on what you repeat. The mind always chooses the path it recognizes, not the path that leads to the best outcome, not the path that matches your goals, the path it knows. This is the hidden power of habit. It turns behavior into familiarity, and familiarity quietly becomes preference. Even when the behavior is harmful, if your routine includes constant distraction, your mind begins to expect distraction. Silence feels uncomfortable. Focus feels unnatural. If your routine includes procrastination, delay begins to feel normal. Urgency begins to feel stressful. The brain is not designed to pursue difficulty. It is designed to conserve energy, to repeat patterns that require the least effort. This is why old habits are difficult to break, not because people lack discipline, because their brain has optimized those behaviors. They have become efficient. You do not consciously decide to open social media. Your hand reaches for it automatically. You do not debate whether to postpone a task. Your mind delays it without resistance. That is what repetition creates. Automatic behavior, a default response that appears before conscious thought. Now consider the opposite. What happens if discipline becomes the familiar path? If work begins automatically? If effort feels normal? If consistency becomes routine? Suddenly the equation changes, because discipline no longer requires constant decision. The action begins without debate. The routine continues without emotional struggle. This is the quiet transformation habits create. They remove friction from the behaviors you repeat most. If distraction is repeated, distraction becomes easy. If discipline is repeated, discipline becomes easy. The brain does not judge the quality of the habit. It strengthens whatever you repeat. That repetition becomes your behavioral gravity, the direction your life slowly drifts toward. This is why two people with identical goals can produce completely different outcomes. One repeats disciplined behavior. The other repeats delay. Months pass. The gap grows quietly. Years pass. The difference becomes undeniable. One life moves forward through steady repetition. The other circles through familiar patterns. Not because their goals were different, because their habits were.
If this message resonates with you,
Like and subscribe for more content like this. This channel is built for people who want control over their focus, not constant noise. There is a moment most people never notice. The moment where a habit becomes identity. At first, behavior feels temporary. You wake early for a few days. You train consistently for a week. You focus on work for a short period. Then the mind begins to draw conclusions. Small, quiet conclusions. This is what you do. This is how you behave. This is who you are. Identity rarely forms through declarations. It forms through repetition, through the actions you repeat often enough that they stop feeling unusual. A person who trains regularly begins to see themselves as disciplined. A person who delays action begins to see themselves as inconsistent. A person who avoids discomfort begins to see effort as unnatural. None of these identities were chosen directly. They were built quietly, action by action, habit by habit. Once identity forms, behavior becomes easier to predict, because people tend to protect the identity they believe about themselves. A disciplined person wakes up and works, not because they debate the decision, because the behavior matches who they believe they are. Meanwhile, someone who sees themselves as inconsistent approaches the same task differently. They hesitate, they delay, they negotiate with themselves. The identity shapes the behavior, and the behavior reinforces the identity. This loop becomes powerful. Each repeated action strengthens the belief behind it. Each belief strengthens the next action. Eventually, the pattern becomes stable. Discipline becomes natural, or delay becomes normal. At that point, effort begins to feel different. The disciplined person experiences less resistance. The inconsistent person experiences constant friction. Not because the work changed, because the identity behind the work changed. That identity was not created through a powerful moment. It was built through repetition. Small actions repeated long enough to shape self-perception. This is why habits are more powerful than goals. Goals aim at outcomes. Habits shape identity, and identity quietly controls behavior. Day after day, choice after choice, until the life you live begins to match the habits you repeated.
Most people try to change their life through
Effort alone. They believe success is created through intensity, through sudden bursts of motivation, through moments where they force themselves to act. For a short time, this works. Energy is high, progress appears quickly, but intensity is temporary. Motivation fades, energy drops, discomfort begins to grow. This is where most people collapse back into old behavior, not because they lack ambition, because they lack systems. A system is simply a structure that repeats behavior, a routine that removes decision, a pattern that makes the right action easier than the wrong one. Without systems, every action becomes a debate. Should I start the work? Should I train today? Should I delay this task? And constant decision creates fatigue. The mind grows tired of negotiating with itself. Soon, the easier option begins to win. Delay, comfort, distraction. Systems remove that negotiation. They turn effort into routine. They turn discipline into structure. Wake up at the same time. Start work at the same hour. Train on the same days. At first, the system feels restrictive, uncomfortable, rigid. But repetition slowly changes the experience. The routine becomes familiar. The actions require less mental effort. Eventually, the system carries you forward. Even when motivation disappears, even when energy is low, even when progress feels slow. Because the system no longer depends on emotion. It depends on repetition. That repetition becomes momentum, and momentum becomes progress. Quiet progress, invisible progress, progress that compounds slowly, until one day the difference becomes obvious. Not because you pushed harder, because you repeated the right actions long enough, and repetition always wins. In the end, most people misunderstand what creates results. They believe success comes from ambition, from powerful goals, from moments of intense determination. But ambition is common. Goals are common. Almost everyone wants a better life. Very few people build the habits required to support it. Because habits require something goals do not. Repetition, patience, consistency without immediate reward. Habits ask you to repeat the same action long before the result becomes visible, long before progress feels dramatic. That repetition feels insignificant in the moment, almost too small to matter. One day of discipline, one training session, one focused hour of work. But repetition compounds, quietly, relentlessly. The first week changes little. The first month feels slow. But the pattern continues. Day after day, habit after habit, routine after routine, until something begins to shift. The action becomes automatic. The resistance begins to fade. The routine begins to carry you forward. At that point, discipline no longer depends on motivation. It depends on structure, on habits strong enough to guide behavior. This is the quiet advantage habits create. They continue working when emotion disappears, when energy drops, when motivation fades. Because habits do not require excitement, they require repetition. Over time, that repetition becomes identity. A disciplined person becomes someone who trains, someone who works, someone who continues. Meanwhile, the person who repeated delay becomes someone who hesitates, someone who restarts, someone who never builds momentum. Years pass. The difference becomes obvious, not because their goals were different, because their habits were. That is the rule most people ignore. You do not rise to your goals. You fall to your habits. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe. Your habits are already shaping your future. Most people believe success comes from advantage, talent, natural ability, some rare gift that separates a few people from everyone else. This belief is comforting, because if talent decides everything, then effort becomes optional. You can always blame the gap on ability. They're naturally better. They're more gifted. They have something I don't. But reality is less dramatic. Most advantages are not visible at the beginning. They are built slowly, quietly, repeated daily. That advantage has a name: discipline. The ability to act when you don't feel like it, to continue when progress is slow, to repeat the work long after excitement fades. This ability rarely looks impressive in the moment. There is no applause for consistency, no audience for quiet effort. Day after day, the disciplined person simply continues. The same practice, the same work, the same small improvements, while others rely on bursts of motivation, short periods of intense effort, followed by long periods of distraction. This difference appears small, almost invisible. But repetition quietly magnifies it. One person practices daily, the other practices occasionally. At first, the gap barely exists. Both seem similar, both seem capable, both seem close in skill. But time reveals the truth. Because discipline compounds. Each repetition sharpens skill. Each day strengthens momentum. Each consistent action adds to the previous one. And eventually, something becomes obvious. The disciplined person begins pulling away. Not through dramatic talent, not through sudden breakthroughs, through quiet accumulation. Small effort repeated long enough. This is the advantage most people ignore, because discipline does not look powerful in a single moment. But over time, it becomes unstoppable. Discipline rarely looks impressive at the beginning. It looks ordinary, repetitive, almost boring. The same routine, the same effort, the same small actions repeated again and again. Most people underestimate this process because repetition feels insignificant. One day of work changes very little. One training session barely moves the needle. So people lose patience. They want dramatic progress, visible improvement, immediate results. When those results don't appear quickly, motivation fades. Consistency breaks. This is where discipline quietly separates people. The disciplined person does not require visible reward. They understand the nature of accumulation. Small effort, repeated daily, becomes powerful. A single step may look meaningless, but 1,000 steps build distance. And that distance eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Someone trains when they feel motivated. Someone else trains whether they feel like it or not. At first, the difference is invisible. Both appear capable, both appear close in skill, both appear equal. But discipline compounds quietly, day by day, week by week, month by month. Skill deepens, understanding sharpens, confidence stabilizes. Meanwhile, the inconsistent person keeps restarting, breaking momentum, losing progress, repeating the same early stages again and again. This is where the real advantage begins forming, because discipline protects momentum, and momentum multiplies progress. Over time, the gap becomes obvious, not because one person was more talented, but because one person kept moving. Discipline turns small effort into lasting advantage, and that advantage only grows with time.
If this message resonates with you,
Like and subscribe for more content like this. This channel is built for people who want control over their focus, not constant noise. The true power of discipline is not visible in a single day, or even a single month, because discipline works quietly. It accumulates beneath the surface, almost unnoticed. Most people evaluate progress too early. They look for dramatic improvement, clear evidence that their effort is working. When that evidence doesn't appear quickly, doubt begins to grow. Motivation fades. So, they slow down. They pause the routine. They restart later. But every restart destroys something important: momentum. The disciplined person avoids this trap, not because progress feels exciting, but because they understand the timeline. Results rarely appear immediately. Skill builds gradually. Strength builds gradually. Mastery builds gradually. But once enough time passes, the accumulated effort begins to show. What once looked like ordinary repetition now appears as skill. What once looked like small effort now appears as confidence. This is when people start asking the wrong question. How are they so good? What advantage do they have? The answer is usually simple. They stayed consistent longer, while others paused, while others restarted, while others waited for motivation. Discipline quietly kept working, day after day, year after year. Eventually, the gap becomes undeniable. Not because of talent, not because of luck, because discipline had more time to compound. This is the hidden advantage most people ignore. Consistency, sustained long enough, becomes impossible to compete with. And by the time others notice the difference, the disciplined person is already far ahead. In the end, discipline is not just a habit. It is a strategic advantage. Because most people rely on unstable forces: motivation, emotion, short bursts of effort. Those forces rise quickly, then disappear just as quickly. Motivation fades, energy drops, excitement disappears. When that happens, progress stops. The routine breaks. Momentum collapses. Discipline works differently. It removes emotion from the equation. The decision is already made. The work happens, whether the mood is strong or weak, whether the day feels productive or difficult. This consistency creates something powerful: predictable effort, predictable progress, predictable growth. Over time, that predictability becomes an advantage others cannot match, because most people remain inconsistent. Their effort rises, then disappears, while the disciplined person continues forward, day after day, year after year, not with dramatic bursts of energy, but with steady pressure. That pressure eventually reshapes everything. Skill improves, confidence stabilizes, opportunities begin to appear. And from the outside, it may look like an advantage, talent, luck. But the truth is simpler. Discipline was working quietly the entire time. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe, because discipline will always remain the real advantage. There is something about real effort that cannot be imitated. People can imitate confidence. They can imitate knowledge. They can imitate discipline in short bursts. But sustained effort reveals the truth. Because effort leaves evidence. Evidence in the work. Evidence in the results. Evidence in the small improvements repeated over time. This is why effort cannot be faked. Someone may speak confidently about their goals. They may describe the life they intend to build. They may explain their plans with perfect clarity. But plans are not proof. Ambition is not proof. Intentions are not proof. Only work produces proof. Work repeated when no one is watching. Work repeated when motivation disappears. Work repeated when progress feels slow. Real effort accumulates quietly, not through dramatic moments, not through public declarations, through repetition. A person who trains consistently begins to change. Their strength improves, their endurance increases, their posture shifts. Those changes cannot be simulated. They cannot be explained away. They cannot be imitated through words. They are the physical result of effort. The same rule applies everywhere, in work, in skill, in discipline. Someone who studies consistently begins to understand things others miss. Someone who practices a skill repeatedly begins to move differently. Someone who works quietly for years begins producing results others cannot replicate. The evidence appears slowly, but once it appears, it is undeniable. Because effort changes structure. It strengthens the mind. It sharpens attention. It builds capability. That capability becomes visible over time, not immediately, but eventually. This is where the illusion begins to collapse. Someone who talks about effort but avoids the work begins to stagnate. Their skill stops improving. Their progress stops moving. Their results remain the same. Meanwhile, the person who repeats the effort continues forward, quietly, consistently. Months pass. The difference becomes visible. Years pass. The difference becomes dramatic. One person developed ability. The other developed explanations. At first, the two can look similar. Both speak confidently. Both claim progress. Both describe their intentions. But time exposes everything. Because effort compounds. Skill compounds. Experience compounds. And the person who consistently applies effort eventually moves into a different category, a different level of capability, a different level of understanding. At that point, the difference cannot be hidden, because effort cannot be faked. It always reveals itself through the work.
If you're done living in distraction,
Like and subscribe. This channel exists to help you protect your attention and build something real. Most people do not avoid effort intentionally. They avoid the discomfort attached to it. Real effort is repetitive, often quiet, often invisible, and rarely exciting. That is why people attempt something else. They attempt to simulate effort. They speak about the work. They plan the work. They imagine the result of the work. But imagining effort is far easier than repeating it. Talking about discipline creates the feeling of discipline. Planning progress creates the illusion of progress. Discussing effort can briefly replace actual effort. The mind accepts this illusion surprisingly easily because the conversation produces emotional satisfaction, recognition, validation. For a moment, it feels like progress has already begun, but nothing has actually changed. Skill has not improved. Strength has not increased. Capability has not expanded. Real progress requires repetition. The same behavior repeated long enough to reshape ability. The same work repeated until competence begins to form. That repetition is what most people quietly avoid. Not because they are incapable, because it is uncomfortable. Effort exposes limitations. It reveals what you cannot yet do. It shows how far you still have to go. And that realization can be difficult to face. So the mind looks for alternatives. Endless preparation, constant research, public declarations. These activities feel productive, but they do not produce results. They only delay the moment where real effort begins. Meanwhile, the person who accepts effort approaches the process differently. They expect discomfort. They expect slow progress. They expect repetition. Instead of trying to avoid these things, they move through them. Day after day, action after action, repetition after repetition. At first, the difference between these two approaches is almost invisible. Both individuals may appear equally ambitious. Both may claim the same intentions. But time begins to separate them. The person who simulates effort remains in the same place. Their ability stays nearly unchanged. Their progress moves slowly, if at all. The person who repeats real effort moves forward, quietly, consistently. Skill begins to form. Confidence begins to stabilize. Results begin to appear. Those results cannot be simulated. They cannot be explained through words. They are the direct outcome of repeated effort. This is the quiet separation that eventually becomes obvious. The person who spoke about effort and the person who applied it. At first, the difference is small, but over time, it becomes undeniable. Because effort cannot be faked, it always reveals itself through the work. Time eventually exposes every illusion, especially the illusion of effort. For a while, appearances can be maintained. Someone can talk about their plans, describe the work they intend to do, explain the progress they expect to make. And for a short time, that illusion can hold. Because effort does not reveal itself immediately. Real effort compounds slowly, quietly, almost invisibly at first. The first days look ordinary. The first weeks show only small changes. The first months rarely produce dramatic results. But repetition begins building something deeper: skill, capability, understanding. These things cannot be rushed. They cannot be simulated. They cannot be borrowed. They must be built. Action by action, hour by hour, day after day. That is the quiet discipline real effort requires. The willingness to continue before results appear. The willingness to repeat the work long before recognition arrives. This is the point where many people stop, because the work still feels heavy. The progress still feels slow. The reward still feels distant, and the mind begins searching for easier paths, shortcuts, explanations, reasons to pause the effort. But the person who continues moves into a different process. Repetition strengthens the mind. It sharpens focus. It builds confidence through experience. Eventually, the work begins to feel different. Not easy, but familiar, structured. The effort becomes part of the routine, part of the identity, part of the way that person moves through the world. At that point, the illusion disappears completely, because real effort produces results, and results cannot be hidden. Skill becomes visible. Understanding becomes deeper. Capability becomes obvious. Meanwhile, the person who avoided effort remains where they started. Still explaining, still planning, still waiting for motivation. Time separates these two paths, slowly, relentlessly. One person built ability, the other built excuses. And once the difference appears, it cannot be hidden, because effort cannot be faked. It always reveals itself through the work. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe. The work always tells the truth.
Most people don't lack
Discipline. They lack decisiveness. Because before every difficult action, a quiet conversation begins. A negotiation. You should wake up early, but maybe just a few more minutes. You should start working, but maybe after one more distraction. This conversation feels harmless, even reasonable. You are not refusing the work. You are simply delaying it, adjusting the timing. But every negotiation weakens something important: your authority over yourself. Because the moment action becomes optional, discipline begins to erode. The mind learns that commitments are flexible. Rules can be adjusted. Decisions can be renegotiated. And slowly, the pattern grows stronger. You delay once, then again, then again. Each delay seems small, almost insignificant, but repetition transforms small actions into habits, and habits quietly define your life. The habit of starting immediately, or the habit of negotiating first. Disciplined people remove this conversation entirely. When something must be done, they begin. No debate, no delay, no internal argument, because they understand something most people ignore. Every negotiation with yourself strengthens hesitation, and hesitation slowly destroys discipline. The first negotiation may seem harmless, but the mind remembers it. It learns that resistance works. It learns that discomfort can be postponed. And once that pattern begins, every difficult action becomes harder to start. Not because the work changed, because your standard changed. You taught yourself that commitment is negotiable, and the mind will continue testing that weakness again and again until hesitation becomes your default response. That is why discipline begins with a simple rule, a rule most people never enforce. Stop negotiating with yourself, because the moment the negotiation ends, action becomes simple. The mind negotiates for one reason. It wants comfort. Not success, not progress, comfort. Because every meaningful action creates resistance. Work requires effort. Discipline requires discomfort. Growth requires pressure. The mind reacts to that pressure immediately. It looks for relief, a delay, a softer option. And that search appears as negotiation. You should start now, but maybe later. You should finish the task, but maybe tomorrow. Each negotiation promises the same thing: temporary relief, just a little more comfort. But comfort has a cost. Every time you delay action, you strengthen avoidance. You reinforce hesitation. The mind begins to expect negotiation. It learns the pattern. Resistance appears, and the debate begins. Should I start now, or wait a little longer? Do it today, or tomorrow? These questions seem small, but they weaken discipline, because every debate delays movement, and delay destroys momentum. Disciplined people approach this differently. They refuse the negotiation entirely. The moment the task appears, they begin. No internal debate, no search for the perfect mood, no waiting for energy. Just action. This simple habit changes everything. Because when negotiation disappears, decisions become immediate. Movement becomes automatic. The mind stops searching for escape. It learns that resistance does not matter. The action will happen anyway. And when the mind understands that, hesitation begins to disappear. Not because discipline becomes easier, but because the negotiation is gone. If you're serious about building this mindset, follow and subscribe. Everything here is about discipline, focus, and real progress. Every time you negotiate with yourself, something weakens. Not your intentions, your authority. Because the moment you make a clear decision, then allow yourself to renegotiate it, the mind learns a dangerous lesson. Your word has no weight. You say you will wake up early, then you delay. You say you will start now, then you wait. On the surface, these look like small compromises. A few minutes, a small delay. One exception. A discipline is not destroyed by one dramatic collapse. It is destroyed by repeated permission. Permission to wait. Permission to soften the rule. Permission to move the standard whenever discomfort appears. And once that pattern is established, the mind begins expecting it. Resistance appears, and immediately the negotiation begins. Maybe later, maybe tomorrow, maybe after one more break. This is the real cost, not just delayed action, internal erosion. Because when your mind stops trusting your decisions, hesitation becomes automatic. Starting becomes heavier. Consistency becomes unstable. The task itself may not be difficult, but now the act of beginning feels difficult. That is what self-negotiation does. It adds friction to every action, and over time, that friction spreads. You delay work, you delay training, you delay difficult conversations, you delay decisions that should already be made. Soon, your life is no longer being shaped by discipline. It is being shaped by avoidance. And avoidance has a quiet way of stealing years, not through one major failure, but through small, daily retreats, small, undone tasks, small, postponed actions. This is how people lose command over themselves, not because they are incapable, but because they keep teaching the mind that discomfort wins. And once discomfort starts winning consistently, discipline stops being a standard. It becomes a suggestion. That is the fracture. The moment your own instructions stop carrying force. And when that happens, you are no longer leading yourself. You are following resistance. The solution is not complicated, but it is strict. You remove the negotiation. Not sometimes. Not when you feel strong. Every time. When the decision has already been made, there is nothing left to discuss. The alarm rings. You stand up. The task appears. You begin. No debate, no delay, no emotional bargaining. At first, the mind will resist this rule. It will search for exceptions. It will try to reopen the conversation. But the standard does not change. Action comes first. Comfort comes later. And slowly, something begins to shift. The mind realizes that resistance no longer changes the outcome. The negotiation has ended. Once that happens, starting becomes easier. Momentum becomes stable. Consistency becomes natural. Not because discipline became comfortable, because hesitation disappeared. You enforced a standard, and the mind adapted to it. That is where real discipline begins. Not in motivation, not in emotion. In the moment you stop bargaining with yourself. Make the decision once, then follow it every day. The mind will eventually obey the rules you enforce. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe. The next decision is already waiting. Most people believe their future is determined by their goals. They set targets, they write plans, they imagine the person they want to become. A stronger body, a disciplined life, a successful career. These visions feel powerful because they create direction. They give the mind something to chase. But there is a quiet problem hidden inside this belief. Goals exist in the future, but life happens in the present. Not in dramatic turning points, not in rare moments of inspiration. In daily behavior, in routines repeated without attention, in habits that quietly shape every decision. And habits are far stronger than ambition, because habits operate automatically, without negotiation, without effort, without conscious thought. They become the default pattern of your behavior, the path your mind follows when energy is low, when motivation disappears, when pressure appears. This is why strong goals alone rarely change anything. You may decide to wake up early, but if your habit is hitting snooze, That habit will decide your morning. You may decide to train consistently, but if your habit is postponing effort, that habit will shape your day. Because when discipline becomes uncomfortable, the mind does not automatically follow ambition. It follows patterns. Patterns repeated yesterday. Patterns repeated last week. Patterns repeated for years. Those patterns become habits, and habits quietly take control. This is the truth most people avoid. You do not become disciplined because you set a goal. You become disciplined because you repeat disciplined behavior. You do not become focused because you want to be focused. You become focused because your habits train your attention. And the same rule works in the opposite direction. Repeated delay becomes procrastination. Repeated distraction becomes lack of focus. Repeated comfort becomes weakness. Every action reinforces the pattern behind it. Every repetition strengthens the habit. Every habit slowly shapes your identity. At first, the difference is small, almost invisible. But repetition compounds. Day after day, year after year, until the result becomes obvious. One person becomes disciplined, another becomes inconsistent. Not because their goals were different, because their habits were. And when pressure finally appears, when motivation disappears, when effort becomes uncomfortable, you do not rise to your goals. You fall to your habits. That quiet rule shapes every life. The problem with goals is not that they are useless. Goals can create direction. They can clarify intention. They can give the mind something to aim toward. But direction alone does not produce movement, because movement depends on behavior, and behavior depends on habit. Most people ignore this distinction. They focus almost entirely on the destination, the body they want, the life they want, the discipline they hope to have. But they rarely examine the system producing their daily actions. The routines that fill their mornings, the distractions that consume their evenings, the patterns repeated every day without attention. Those patterns quietly determine everything. You may set a goal to train every morning, but if your habit is staying up late, waking early becomes difficult. You may decide to focus on work, but if your habit is constant distraction, focus becomes unstable. This is why many ambitious people remain stuck. Their goals point in one direction, but their habits pull them in another. Every day becomes a small internal conflict. The goal demands effort. The habit demands comfort. And comfort usually wins. Not because people lack ambition, but because habits operate automatically. They require no decision. They follow the path already carved into behavior. That path was built through repetition, through small actions repeated hundreds of times, through routines that slowly became automatic. Once a behavior becomes habitual, it becomes the mind's default response. And defaults are powerful. They appear the moment attention drops, the moment energy fades, the moment discipline feels difficult. This is the moment where goals usually lose, because a goal is an intention, a habit is a behavior, and behavior always decides the outcome. If your habit is discipline, you move forward even when motivation disappears. If your habit is delay, you hesitate the moment effort becomes uncomfortable. That hesitation slowly compounds. Tasks are postponed. Momentum breaks. Consistency disappears. Soon the goal begins to feel distant, unreachable, unrealistic. But the problem was never the goal. The problem was the system supporting it, the habits shaping daily behavior. Because no matter how ambitious your goal may be, your habits will always determine how close you get. And in the end, they decide how far you fall.
If this message resonates with you,
Like and subscribe for more content like this. This channel is built for people who want control over their focus, not constant noise.
habits do something goals never can.
They remove decision. A goal requires constant intention. You must remember it. You must think about it. You must choose it again and again. But habits operate differently. They run automatically, without negotiation, without motivation. That is why habits quietly control behavior. Because the mind prefers efficiency. It avoids constant decision-making. It follows the path already practiced. Once a behavior has been repeated enough times, the brain turns it into a shortcut, a default response, a routine that runs without effort. This is why habits become powerful over time. They eliminate friction. They remove hesitation. They simplify action. But the same rule works in both directions. Disciplined habits create disciplined lives. Undisciplined habits create undisciplined lives. The mind does not care which one you build. It simply strengthens whatever you repeat. Wake up late enough times, and waking late becomes normal. Procrastinate often enough, and delay becomes automatic. Soon, you are no longer making choices. You are following patterns. This is where most people lose control of their behavior. They believe they are deciding each action, but their habits have already decided. Comfort becomes the default. Distraction becomes the routine. Effort becomes rare. And slowly, ambition begins to collapse. Because a goal cannot compete with a habit that runs automatically. A decision must fight resistance. A habit simply executes. This is why disciplined people focus less on goals and more on systems. Small behaviors repeated every day, small routines that remove hesitation, small actions that slowly reshape identity. Eventually, those routines become automatic. The work begins without debate. The effort continues without resistance. And once discipline becomes habitual, progress stops depending on motivation. It becomes inevitable.
This is where most people misunderstand change.
They try to force discipline through intensity, a sudden burst of motivation, a dramatic new plan. They decide that everything will change at once. Wake up earlier, work harder, eliminate every distraction. For a few days, it works. Energy is high, effort feels exciting, but intensity is temporary. Fatigue appears, discomfort grows. The routine becomes difficult to sustain. Without habits supporting the effort, the system collapses. Momentum disappears. Old patterns return. Not because the goal was wrong, because the structure behind it never changed. A goal can inspire action, but habits sustain action. That difference is everything. A disciplined life is rarely built through dramatic transformation. It is built through small, repeated behaviors. Actions simple enough to repeat every day. Wake up at the same time. Start the work without debate. Train even when progress feels slow, that these actions appear insignificant, but repetition changes their weight. Each day strengthens the pattern. Soon the routine becomes normal. Discipline stops feeling like effort. It becomes the default behavior. The mind no longer debates the action. The action simply happens. That is when habits begin working for you. And when habits begin working for you, progress stops depending on motivation. It becomes part of your daily structure. That structure is stronger than ambition, stronger than emotion, stronger than temporary bursts of effort. Because once habits take control, your behavior stops drifting. It moves in one direction, forward. In the end, the difference between people is rarely ambition. Most people want similar things: a better life, stronger discipline, meaningful progress. The difference is not what they want. The difference is what they repeat, because repetition becomes habit, and habit quietly becomes identity. A person who trains consistently begins to see themselves as disciplined. A person who delays action begins to see themselves as unreliable. Not because they decided those identities consciously, but because behavior reinforced them. Each repeated action sends a signal. This is who you are. This is how you behave. This is the standard you accept. Over time, those signals accumulate. The mind stops debating them. It simply accepts them. That acceptance becomes powerful because identity shapes behavior, and behavior reinforces identity. A disciplined person does not wake up asking if they should act. Action is already part of who they are. The routine continues without debate. Meanwhile, the person who built habits of delay faces constant resistance. Every task feels heavier. Every effort feels unstable. Every goal feels distant. Not because they lack ability, because their habits built a different identity. One pattern moves forward. The other pattern hesitates. Years pass. The difference grows. What once looked like small habits becomes a completely different life. This is the quiet truth behind every long-term result. You do not become what you want. You become what you repeat. Because when pressure appears, when motivation disappears, when effort becomes uncomfortable, you do not rise to your goals. You fall to your habits. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe. Your habits are already shaping tomorrow. Everyone says they want discipline, but very few people understand when discipline actually begins. It does not begin when you feel motivated. It does not begin when you feel inspired. And it certainly does not begin when the work feels exciting. Discipline begins when the work becomes boring, when the task is repetitive, when the progress feels slow, when nothing about the moment feels rewarding. Those are the hours that matter. Anyone can work when the energy is high. Anyone can push forward when the results are visible. Anyone can stay focused when the excitement is fresh. But excitement fades. Every project eventually becomes routine. Every skill eventually becomes repetition. Every path eventually becomes quiet, uneventful work. And that is the moment most people disappear. Not dramatically, not with a clear decision to quit. They simply slow down. They delay a little longer. They lose urgency. At first it looks harmless. A skipped day, a delayed task, a small break from the routine. But boredom is where commitment is tested, because boredom removes the emotional reward. The excitement disappears, the novelty fades, and without those things, only discipline remains. This is where the separation begins. Some people depend on motivation. They wait to feel energized. They wait to feel ready. But feelings are unreliable. Energy rises and falls. Focus comes and goes. Motivation appears, then disappears. Discipline does not depend on those things. Discipline is a decision repeated daily, regardless of mood, regardless of excitement, regardless of boredom. The disciplined person understands something simple. Progress is usually quiet, uneventful, repetitive. It does not always feel meaningful in the moment, but the work continues anyway. Page after page, rep after rep, day after day. Not because it feels exciting, but because it is necessary. And over time, those uneventful hours accumulate. Small improvements compound. Skill begins to sharpen. Quiet effort becomes visible results, but those results only belong to people who endure boredom. Because boredom is the gate most people never walk through. The moment the work becomes ordinary, the moment the excitement fades, that is when discipline truly begins.
If you're done living in distraction,
Like and subscribe. This channel exists to help you protect your attention and build something real.
most people believe
Productivity depends on motivation. They wait to feel ready. They wait to feel focused. They wait to feel energized. But that approach quietly builds inconsistency. Because motivation is unstable, it rises, it fades, and it rarely appears when work is repetitive. This is the trap many people live inside. They associate action with emotion. If the energy feels high, they move. If the energy feels low, they wait. At first, this seems harmless, even reasonable. But over time, the pattern becomes clear. Action becomes rare. Momentum becomes fragile. Progress becomes inconsistent. Because emotions are unreliable guides. Some days, energy is strong. Other days, it disappears completely. And if work depends on emotion, work becomes unpredictable. Disciplined people approach this differently. They remove emotion from the decision. The work is scheduled. The work is expected. The work simply begins. Whether the mood is strong or weak, whether motivation appears or not, this removes hesitation. The mind stops negotiating. It stops asking whether the moment feels right, because the decision has already been made. Work happens. Some days the focus arrives quickly. Other days it takes longer. Some days the work feels smooth. Other days it feels slow. But the effort remains consistent, and consistency creates something motivation never can. Momentum. When work happens daily, progress begins to accumulate. Skills improve. Understanding deepens. Confidence grows. Not dramatically, gradually, almost invisibly. But that quiet accumulation separates disciplined people from everyone else. Because most people stop when work becomes dull, or difficult, or emotionally unrewarding. Disciplined people continue anyway. They understand something simple. The most important work is rarely exciting. It is repetitive, uneventful, sometimes boring. But the work continues, because progress belongs to those who act, even when motivation disappears. In the end, discipline is not complicated. It is simply the decision to continue. Continue when the work feels slow. Continue when the excitement disappears. Continue when the routine becomes repetitive. These moments feel ordinary, uneventful, sometimes even dull, but that is exactly why they matter. Because boredom reveals commitment. Anyone can begin something new. Anyone can push forward during the early excitement. Anyone can work when results appear quickly. But very few people continue when the process becomes quiet, when the improvements are small, when the effort feels repetitive, when the reward feels distant. This is where most people slow down. They look for something more exciting, something more stimulating, something that produces faster results. But disciplined people recognize something different. Real progress rarely feels dramatic. It builds quietly, day after day, action after action. One page written, one repetition completed, one task finished. Individually, these actions appear small, almost insignificant. But accumulated over time, they become powerful. Because consistency compounds, skill improves, confidence grows, understanding deepens, and eventually the results appear. Not because of bursts of motivation, not because of sudden inspiration, but because the work continued when it was boring. That is the moment discipline reveals its value. The quiet hours no one noticed, the routine no one admired, the repetition most people avoided. Those moments built the outcome, and they always do. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe. The work continues tomorrow.